Nobody in the frontier town of Red Hollow could explain why the old mountain cabin still stood. Some claimed the man living there had survived winters that buried whole valleys beneath snow. Others swore he spoke more to wolves than to people. Children whispered that anyone sent to his cabin never came back the same. But none of those stories were true. The real story began with a frightened 19-year-old girl riding toward those mountains with tears she refused to let anyone see. She believed she had been sold to a monster. She had no idea she was riding toward the first person who would ever treat her like she mattered. The spring of 1885 arrived gently across Montana territory. Wildflowers colored the open meadows, and warm sunlight spilled across the rolling hills. Wagon wheels carved fresh tracks through the muddy roads while ranchers prepared their fields for another season. For everyone else, spring meant new beginnings. For Abigail Turner, it felt like the end. She sat silently in the back of a worn wagon, holding a faded cloth bag that contained everything she owned. 2 dresses, her late mother's Bible, a silver thimble, and an old photograph with its edges worn smooth from years of hiding it beneath her pillow. She looked back one last time, as Red Hollow disappeared behind a curtain of dust. No one waved goodbye. No one called her name. Even the house where she had grown up looked smaller with every passing mile, until it vanished completely. The driver clicked his tongue at the horses, but never looked at her. Perhaps he pitied her. Perhaps he had already convinced himself there was nothing worth saving. Abigail rested trembling hands in her lap. She had not cried when her stepmother made the bargain. She had not cried while strangers counted gold coins across the kitchen table. She had not cried when the papers were signed. But now, with nothing familiar left behind her, one quiet tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away before anyone could see. Her father had always told her that tears should never be wasted on people who stopped caring. He had been gone for 8 years. A falling beam inside a silver mine had ended his life before Abigail reached her 12th birthday. Everything changed after that. Within months, her stepmother, Lenora Turner, controlled every acre of their struggling ranch. At first, she pretended kindness. She promised neighbors she would raise Abigail like her own daughter. Those promises faded almost as quickly as the paint on the front porch. By the following winter, Abigail woke before daylight every morning. She hauled water from the creek, fed the chickens, repaired fences, cooked every meal, washed clothes until her fingers cracked from cold water, cleaned every room, mended torn shirts by lantern light long after everyone else had gone to sleep. If something broke, Lenora blamed Abigail. If crops failed, she blamed Abigail. If storms ruined the fields, somehow Abigail carried that blame too. "You eat more than you're worth," Lenora often said while pushing another pile of chores toward her. Those words followed Abigail through every season. She slowly stopped believing she deserved anything better. The neighbors noticed. Some looked away. Others whispered. But nobody interfered. Life on the frontier had taught people to mind their own business, even when silence became another form of cruelty. Everything finally changed on a windy afternoon when a traveling fur merchant arrived at the Turner Ranch. His wagon overflowed with animal pelts, steel traps, blankets, and supplies gathered from remote mountain settlements. Lenora welcomed him inside with a smile Abigail had not seen in years. The kitchen door remained closed for nearly an hour. Voices rose. Coins clinked against the wooden table. When Abigail was finally called inside, neither adult looked at her. The merchant studied her as though inspecting a horse before purchase. She lowered her eyes. Lenora folded her arms. "You'll be leaving tomorrow morning." Abigail blinked. "Leaving? You're going into the mountains." "I don't understand." "You don't need to." The merchant cleared his throat. "A man named Silas Granger lives beyond Eagle Ridge." Abigail had heard that name before. Everyone had. Children stopped talking whenever someone mentioned him. Hunters claimed he lived alone among cliffs where bears wandered freely. Some insisted he buried trespassers. Others believed he had gone mad after losing his family years ago. No one seemed to know which stories were real. Lenora slid a folded paper across the table. "He's agreed to take you." Abigail stared at the document without touching it. "What do you mean, take me?" Lenora's answer came without the smallest trace of guilt. "You'll become his wife." The room fell silent. Even the crackling fire seemed to disappear. Abigail searched her stepmother's face for some sign that this was a terrible joke. There was none. "I don't want this." Lenora shrugged. "You weren't asked." Abigail stepped backward. "You can't sell me." "I didn't." Her stepmother smiled coldly. "I arranged your future." The merchant avoided Abigail's eyes. He quietly gathered the signed papers. Outside, wind rattled the loose shutters. Inside, something far more painful broke. Not her heart. Her hope. She spent that night sitting beside the small bedroom window where her mother once sang lullabies during thunderstorms. Moonlight rested across the wooden floor. She unfolded the old photograph. It showed her mother standing beside her father beneath a cottonwood tree. Both were smiling. Abigail gently traced their faces. "I wish you were still here," she whispered. A soft knock interrupted the silence. It was Mrs. Collins, the elderly widow from the neighboring ranch. She carried a small basket filled with fresh biscuits and dried apples. "I heard," the old woman said quietly. Abigail forced a smile. Mrs. Collins reached into her apron and placed something into Abigail's hand. A tiny brass compass. "It belonged to my husband." "I can't take this." "You can." The old woman's weathered fingers closed around Abigail's hand. "Sometimes the right direction isn't the one people choose for us." Abigail looked at the compass. Its little needle slowly settled north. Mrs. Collins smiled sadly. "I've lived long enough to know that rumors usually hide the truth. What if they're right about him?" The widow looked toward the distant mountains, barely visible beneath the moon. "Then may the Lord protect you." She paused. "But if they're wrong?" Her gentle smile returned. "Don't let fear keep you from seeing the man beneath the stories." Those words stayed with Abigail through the long, sleepless night. Before sunrise, she climbed into the merchant's wagon. Lenora never hugged her. Never wished her well. She simply closed the front door. The sound echoed harder than any goodbye. The journey lasted 2 long days. The wide prairie slowly disappeared behind endless forests of towering pine. Crystal rivers rushed over smooth stone. Snow still clung to distant mountain peaks. Elk wandered through open valleys untouched by fences. Everything felt larger, quieter, lonelier. At night they camped beneath skies overflowing with stars. The merchant rarely spoke. When he did, it was only to warn Abigail about steep trails or rough crossings ahead. She appreciated the silence. Words would not have changed where she was going. By the afternoon of the second day, the wagon reached the edge of Eagle Ridge. The narrow trail twisted between enormous granite cliffs. One careless step could send horse and rider tumbling into the canyon below. The merchant slowed the team. "We're close." Abigail's heartbeat quickened. Every frightening story she had ever heard returned at once. She imagined a filthy shack hidden among rocks. She pictured a wild-eyed giant waiting with chains. Instead, the trees opened into a peaceful valley. A clear stream wound through green grass. Apple trees surrounded a sturdy log cabin. Smoke curled gently from a stone chimney. A fenced pasture held several healthy horses. Fresh vegetables grew beside neat rows of herbs. Someone had carefully planted flowers beneath every window. Nothing looked abandoned. Nothing looked frightening. Everything looked loved. A tall man stepped onto the porch. He was broad-shouldered, with weathered hands and a dark beard touched by gray despite not being old. His buckskin coat showed years of careful repairs instead of neglect. His hat was faded by countless seasons beneath mountain skies. His face carried deep lines, shaped more by grief than anger. His steady blue eyes rested quietly on Abigail. Not with ownership. Not with pride. Only concern. The merchant climbed down first. "You must be Sila's." The mountain man nodded once. Then his eyes returned to Abigail. She slowly climbed from the wagon, expecting commands. None came. Sila's picked up her small cloth bag with surprising care, as though afraid something inside might break. He noticed the worn handle beginning to tear. "I'll mend this tonight," he said gently. It was the first thing he ever said to her. His voice was calm, low, nothing like the monster she had imagined. Abigail could barely answer. "Thank you." Sila's glanced toward the fading afternoon sky before speaking again. "You've had a long trip." He stepped aside and opened the cabin door. "You should eat while the stew is still warm." No demands. No shouting. No rough hands grabbing her arm. Only a simple invitation. Abigail stood frozen. She had prepared herself for cruelty. Kindness was something she no longer knew how to receive. As she slowly crossed the cabin doorway, she noticed something that made her stop. Above the stone fireplace rested a faded wooden carving. A little girl holding her father's hand. Sila's followed her gaze. For the first time, sadness flickered across his face so deeply that he quickly looked away. He quietly carried her bag toward the spare bedroom. Outside, the wind stirred the pine trees. Inside the cabin, secrets older than either of them waited beneath the silence. And before that first evening on the mountain came to an end, Abigail would discover that the man everyone feared was hiding a sorrow far greater than anyone in Red Hollow had ever imagined. Morning arrived quietly over Eagle Ridge. Golden sunlight slipped through the tall pines, and a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh earth across the valley. Birds sang from the treetops, while the nearby stream rushed over smooth stones, as if the mountain itself had forgotten every frightening story people told about it. Abigail woke slowly, confused for a moment by the unfamiliar room. Then everything returned. The wagon, the long journey, the mountain man. She sat upright, expecting to hear shouting outside or heavy footsteps marching toward her door. Instead, she smelled fresh bread. For a few seconds, she simply listened. A horse snorted softly in the pasture. A kettle whistled over the fire. Someone chopped wood with calm, steady swings. Nothing sounded dangerous. She carefully opened her bedroom door. Silas stood near the stove with his back turned, placing biscuits onto a wooden plate. He noticed her reflection in the small window before she spoke. "I hope you slept well." His voice remained as calm as it had the day before. Abigail nodded. "I did. Good." He set another plate on the table. "Breakfast is ready." She hesitated. "Can I help?" He looked surprised. "You've traveled for 2 days." "I can still work." Silas smiled faintly. "You'll have plenty of chances." Those simple words unsettled her. No one had ever suggested that rest was something she deserved. They ate mostly in silence. Fresh biscuits, wild honey, smoked trout from the mountain stream, warm coffee. It was the first breakfast Abigail could remember where no one criticized the way she held a fork or rushed her to finish another chore. Afterward, Silas carried the dishes toward the wash basin. She quickly stood. "I'll clean them." "You don't have to." "I want to." He studied her for a moment before handing her the towel. Fair enough. That single exchange felt strangely normal. Almost peaceful. When the dishes were finished, Silas led her outside. Morning sunlight spread across the valley, revealing details she had missed the evening before. A sturdy horse barn stood beyond the garden. Beehives rested near blooming wildflowers. Apple trees lined the fence. Everything had been carefully maintained. Nothing had been neglected. Silas noticed her looking around. "My wife planted those trees." Abigail looked toward him. He rarely volunteered information. "I've kept them alive." His voice grew quieter. "They deserved that." Before she could ask another question, he walked toward the barn. She realized there were subjects he wasn't ready to speak about. Not yet. The days settled into a peaceful rhythm, unlike anything Abigail had known. Silas left early each morning to check trap lines or repair fences. Sometimes he returned carrying fish from the river. Other days he gathered herbs or firewood. He worked hard but never hurried. Everything he did had purpose. When Abigail offered to help, he never barked orders. Instead, he patiently explained each task. How to repair broken fence rails. How to recognize poisonous berries. How to read fresh animal tracks. How to predict storms simply by watching clouds drift across distant peaks. No lesson came with anger. If she made a mistake, he simply showed her again. At first, Abigail apologized constantly. "I'm sorry. I should have done better. I'll fix it." Silas finally stopped beside her one afternoon while they repaired a section of fence. "You apologize too much." She lowered her eyes. "I usually have to." "Not here." Those two words settled somewhere deep inside her heart. She wanted to believe them. She simply didn't know how. One rainy evening, she wandered through the cabin, while Silas worked outside covering stacks of firewood. She noticed shelves filled with books. There were journals, maps, old adventure novels, a collection of poetry, even books about gardening and medicine. She gently picked one up. "You can read." Silas stepped inside, brushing rain from his coat. "I enjoy it. I've never seen this many books. They kept the winters from feeling so long." She carefully returned the book. "My father taught me to read." Silas smiled. "Mine did too." For the first time, their conversation felt less like two strangers sharing a cabin, and more like two people finding pieces of common ground. That evening rain drummed softly against the roof, while wind swayed the lantern hanging outside. Silas reached toward the corner beside the fireplace. He picked up the old violin Abigail had noticed on her first night. "You play?" "A little." He tightened one string before lifting the instrument beneath his chin. The first notes filled the cabin. Slow, gentle, beautiful. Abigail closed her eyes. The melody carried memories she could almost feel but couldn't explain. When it ended, neither of them spoke for several moments. "My mother used to sing," she whispered. Silas lowered the violin. "So did my wife." Silence returned. Not an uncomfortable silence. One filled with shared memories. Shared loss. Neither of them realized they had just taken the first real step toward trusting one another. Weeks passed. Spring slowly climbed higher into the mountains. Abigail's cheeks regained healthy color. Her frightened expression softened. She laughed for the first time after watching two stubborn goats escape their pen and chase Silas across the meadow. He pretended to scold them while they ignored every word. She laughed until tears filled her eyes. Silas looked over. There it is. She wiped her face. What? Your smile. Abigail looked away, embarrassed. I forgot I still had one. Silas answered quietly. I don't think you forgot. He looked toward the mountains. I think someone made you believe you weren't supposed to. His words stayed with her for days. One afternoon, Abigail entered the small storage room searching for flour. A loose board beneath an old cabinet shifted beneath her foot. Curious, she lifted it carefully. Hidden below rested a small wooden box. She froze. Perhaps she shouldn't open it. But something told her this wasn't treasure. It was memory. Inside lay a tiny pair of worn leather boots, a faded blue ribbon, several children's drawings, and one carefully folded letter. Before she could unfold it, footsteps approached. She quickly closed the lid. Silas stopped in the doorway. His eyes settled on the open floorboard. For just a moment, the calm mountain man looked shaken. I'm sorry, Abigail whispered. I wasn't looking for anything. He slowly walked over. His weathered fingers rested on the small box. My daughter made those drawings. His voice barely rose above the wind outside. She loved drawing birds. Abigail remained silent. Silas carefully picked up the little boots. She was 6. The room felt smaller. I lost both of them during a fever outbreak. He stared quietly at the tiny shoes. I was trapping nearly a week's ride from home. His eyes glistened. I came back too late. Abigail felt her own chest tighten. No rumor in Red Hollow had ever spoken about this. They called him cold, dangerous, heartless. Yet standing before her was simply a father who never stopped missing his little girl. I've never moved these things. He gently returned the boots. Some memories deserve a place where time can't touch them. Abigail quietly placed the lid back onto the box. I'm glad you kept them. Silas looked at her with grateful eyes. So am I. From that day forward, something changed between them. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but little by little. Trust replaced caution. One bright afternoon, they rode together into a nearby mountain meadow to gather medicinal herbs. While filling their baskets, several riders appeared along the tree line. Abigail immediately tensed. Silas calmly raised one hand. The newcomers wore buckskin clothing, decorated with careful beadwork. Their leader guided his horse forward with quiet confidence. Instead of reaching for weapons, both men shook hands. Abigail watched with surprise. You've returned early this season, the leader said warmly. The snow melted sooner, Silas replied. The two men exchanged supplies. Medicinal roots, coffee, blankets, tools. The conversation flowed like old friends catching up. On the ride home, Abigail finally asked, I thought people feared everyone living beyond these mountains. Silas smiled. Fear usually grows where people stop listening. She remembered Mrs. Collins saying nearly the same thing. Rumors had hidden the truth again. As they neared the cabin, Silas suddenly stopped his horse. He dismounted beside a patch of soft mud. Fresh hoofprints crossed the trail. More than one horse. Several riders. And they were recent. Silas crouched quietly. His expression hardened. What is it? Abigail asked. He measured one deep print with his hand. 6 horses. You know them. I don't. He stood slowly. But they weren't hunting. How can you tell? He pointed toward broken branches leading away from the trail. They left the road on purpose. His eyes scanned the silent forest. They didn't want to be seen. Neither spoke during the ride home. The peaceful valley suddenly felt different. That evening, Silas checked every stable door twice. He brought extra water inside. Then he disappeared into the woods, carrying only a lantern and his rifle. When he returned long after sunset, Abigail noticed fresh concern behind his calm expression. "What happened?" He quietly locked the cabin door. "I found another camp." "Who are they?" "I don't know yet." He placed several extra cartridges beside the Winchester hanging above the fireplace. "But until I do." He looked directly at her. "Stay close to the cabin." Outside, somewhere beyond the dark pines, a horse gave a distant whinny. Neither of them had brought another horse into the valley. Someone else was already on the mountain. And whoever they were watching the cabin. If you believe one act of kindness can change a life, take a moment to like this story. The greatest battles are often won long before anyone draws a weapon. The mountain no longer felt peaceful. Every breeze that moved through the pine trees seemed to carry a warning. The birds that usually filled the valley with cheerful songs had grown strangely quiet. Even the horses shifted uneasily inside the barn, lifting their heads whenever distant sounds echoed through the forest. Abigail stood beside the cabin window before sunrise, staring toward the dark tree line. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Watching. Waiting. Silas stepped onto the porch carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to her before looking toward the same stretch of forest. "I didn't sleep much either," he admitted. "You think they're still nearby?" "I know they are." His answer came without hesitation. "The campfire I found last night wasn't made by travelers." He pointed toward the northern ridge. "They're staying hidden." Abigail wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "What do they want?" Silas remained silent for several moments. "Maybe supplies." He paused. "Maybe something else." Neither liked the second possibility. After breakfast, Silas saddled both horses. "We're moving a few things." Abigail frowned. "Running away." He smiled faintly. "No." He tightened another saddle strap. "Preparing." They rode nearly an hour into a narrow valley hidden behind enormous boulders. There, beneath thick pine branches, rested another small cabin no larger than a single room. Inside were blankets, dried food, fresh water, lanterns, and medicine. "You built this?" Silas nodded. "Years ago." "For emergencies?" "For winters." He looked around quietly. "And days exactly like this." Abigail slowly realized the mountain man never depended on luck. He survived because he always prepared before danger arrived. On the ride home, he began teaching her things no one had ever bothered teaching before. How to move quietly across dry leaves. How to recognize broken branches left by passing riders. How to whistle like a mountain jay without frightening wildlife. How to disappear among rocks and trees without leaving tracks. Every lesson carried one message. Stay alive. When they reached the cabin, Silas removed the Winchester from above the fireplace. He carefully placed it across the kitchen table. Abigail stared at it. "I've never fired one." "You'll learn." "What if I miss?" "You probably will." He smiled kindly. "So did I." His patience settled her nerves. He showed her how to hold the rifle firmly against her shoulder. How to breathe slowly. How to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. The first shot struck the dirt several feet from the target. Abigail lowered the rifle. "I'm terrible." Silas calmly reset the wooden target. No, you saw that? I saw someone trying too hard. He walked beside her. Trust yourself. She took another breath. Raised the rifle. Focused on the center. This time the bullet struck the edge of the target. Silas nodded proudly. There you are. For the first time she believed she might actually be capable of protecting herself. That afternoon clouds drifted lazily across a bright blue sky. Everything looked normal. Until Dusty, Silas's old shepherd dog, suddenly began barking toward the southern trail. Silas froze. He slowly climbed onto the porch. 3 riders emerged from the trees. They wore long coats coated with trail dust. Each carried rifles. The man in front removed his hat. His scarred face held a crooked smile that never reached his eyes. Afternoon. Silas didn't return the greeting. What brings you here? The stranger looked around the valley. Beautiful place. His eyes settled on Abigail. And prettier company than I expected. Silas quietly stepped between them. What do you want? The stranger chuckled. My name's Wade Mercer. We've never met. No. Wade glanced toward the barn. But we've heard plenty about you. His companions laughed softly. They say you're the only man alive who knows every trail through these mountains. Silas remained expressionless. I know enough. We're looking for a safe route west. I can't help. You could. I won't. Silence settled across the valley. Even the wind seemed to stop. Wade slowly climbed down from his horse. His boots crunched across the gravel. We're willing to pay. Silas folded his arms. I'm not interested. Wade's smile disappeared. I wasn't asking. Abigail felt her heartbeat quicken. Silas never moved. This mountain has buried better men than you. The outlaw laughed. Maybe. He climbed back into the saddle. We'll give you time to reconsider. Before leaving, he looked once more toward Abigail. Think carefully. Then the 3 riders disappeared into the trees. Dust settled slowly behind them. Abigail finally released the breath she'd been holding. They're dangerous. Silas nodded. Very. Who are they? I don't know every face. He looked toward the trail. But I know the kind. That evening he quietly reinforced the cabin shutters. Checked every window. Moved extra firewood inside. Then he disappeared into the barn. Curious, Abigail followed. Silas knelt beside the floor, lifting several wooden planks. Hidden beneath them rested neatly stacked ammunition, food supplies, blankets, and another rifle. You planned all this years ago. He looked up. When you spend enough winters alone. He smiled gently. You learn tomorrow isn't promised. Abigail suddenly understood something else. Everything inside this cabin had been built not for one person, but for a family, long before she ever arrived. Later that night, rain began falling softly. They sat beside the fireplace while thunder rolled across distant peaks. The violin rested nearby. You haven't played lately, Abigail said. Silas looked toward it. I haven't wanted to. You should. He hesitated, then picked it up. The melody that filled the cabin sounded different this time. Not as lonely. Somehow warmer. Abigail smiled quietly. You played that for them. Silas nodded. My wife loved it. He looked into the fire. My daughter used to fall asleep before the last verse. Neither spoke afterward. Words weren't necessary. Some grief speaks loudest through silence. The following morning brought another surprise. A rider approached carrying a silver badge. Sheriff Owen Carter climbed from his horse with visible relief. "I've been looking for you." Silas shook his hand. "What happened?" "The Baxter gang robbed a payroll wagon 3 days ago." Abigail immediately remembered Wade's scarred face. "They're headed into these mountains." The sheriff nodded. "We tracked them as far as Cedar Pass." Silas's expression hardened. "3 men came here yesterday." Sheriff Carter sighed. "Then you've met their scouts." "There are more. 9 altogether." Abigail felt the color leave her face. 9 armed outlaws. The sheriff unfolded a rough map across the porch railing. "If they reach Hollow Canyon, they'll disappear." Silas studied the map carefully. "They'll never make it through Hollow Canyon." The sheriff looked surprised. "Why not?" "The bridge washed away during spring floods." "How certain are you?" "I repaired part of it." Silas pointed farther east. "If they're smart, they'll head for Iron Creek instead." Sheriff Carter quickly called his deputies. Within minutes, they were riding toward the eastern trail. Before leaving, the sheriff looked back. "You just saved us 2 days." Silas shrugged. "I know these mountains." The sheriff smiled. "They're lucky to have you." After the lawman disappeared, Abigail looked at Silas. "You've helped them before." "A few times." "You never told me." "I didn't think it mattered." She stared at him. "You've spent years protecting people." Silas adjusted the saddle blanket. "I simply did what was right." Abigail suddenly understood why the rumors hurt him so deeply. People had called him dangerous, while he quietly protected strangers without asking for credit. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the mountains, Abigail carried fresh bread toward the cellar. She paused. A folded piece of paper rested beneath the front door. She picked it up. There were only 6 words written in rough black ink. "Last chance, help us or suffer." Her hands trembled. Silas read the note once, then calmly tossed it into the fire. "You aren't frightened?" she asked. He watched the paper curl into ashes. "I am." She blinked. "You are?" He nodded honestly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear." He looked at her with steady eyes. "It's deciding fear won't make your choices." Abigail had never heard anyone explain bravery that way. For years, she believed brave people simply weren't afraid. Now she knew better. Night settled over Eagle Ridge. The moon climbed above the pines. Everything seemed peaceful once again. Until Dusty began growling. Not barking. Growling. Silas quietly extinguished the lantern. The cabin fell into darkness. Outside, a faint orange glow flickered between the trees. Then another. And another. Torches. Moving slowly through the forest. Silas counted under his breath. 1, 3, 5. He stopped. There are more than before. Abigail gripped the Winchester tightly. The riders had returned. This time, they hadn't come to talk. The first gunshot never came. Instead, silence settled over the valley like a heavy blanket. The glow of the torches grew brighter between the pine trees. One by one, shadowed riders emerged from the darkness until nearly a dozen horses surrounded the clearing. Their leader, Wade Mercer, rode to the front with the same crooked smile Abigail remembered. Only this time, there was no pretending. "We gave you a choice," he called. Silas stood on the porch with the Winchester resting calmly in his hands. "And I gave you an answer." Wade sighed dramatically. That's unfortunate. He raised one hand. Several outlaws spread out toward the barn while others moved around the cabin, searching for another way inside. Abigail stayed low behind the front window, remembering every lesson Silas had taught her. Do not panic. Do not rush. Think before you move. She tightened her grip on the rifle. Silas spoke quietly without taking his eyes off the men outside. They're trying to divide us. What do we do? We stay patient. A loud crash echoed from the barn. One outlaw had kicked open the stable door. The frightened horses screamed and kicked against their stalls. Another man lit a torch. Abigail's heart raced. They'll burn everything. Silas's expression hardened. No. He lifted his rifle. A single shot shattered the outlaw's torch, sending it spinning harmlessly into the damp grass. The burning cloth hissed as it struck the ground. The gang froze. They had expected fear. Instead, they found discipline. Wade narrowed his eyes. So that's how we're doing this. He signaled his men. Gunfire erupted across the valley. Bullets struck fence posts and scattered splinters through the air. Silas fired only when necessary, forcing the attackers to stay behind rocks and trees rather than charging the cabin. Abigail remembered his words. Every bullet should have a purpose. She remained hidden until movement caught her eye. One outlaw had slipped behind the smokehouse and was quietly making his way toward the rear door. She steadied the Winchester. Her breathing slowed. The world became strangely quiet. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the ground directly in front of the man, spraying dirt across his boots. Startled, he stumbled backward and dropped the lantern he had been carrying. It rolled harmlessly into the mud. Silas glanced toward the back of the cabin. Their eyes met for only a second. He nodded. Not because she had fired. Because she had stayed calm. Outside, Wade realized the cabin would not fall easily. He shouted for two riders to circle toward the northern trees. Silas immediately understood. They're heading for the ridge. Why? If they reach the rocks above us. He never finished. Both of them knew. The high ground would leave the cabin exposed. Silas quickly turned to Abigail. Remember the hidden trail. She nodded. The path behind the spring. Good. He handed her a small hunting horn carved from elk antler. If I tell you to run, take this to Sheriff Carter. What about you? I'll buy you time. I'm not leaving you. His eyes softened. You aren't leaving me. He smiled faintly. You're saving both of us. Before either could say another word, a distant sound echoed through the mountains. Not thunder. Horse hooves. Many of them. Wade heard them too. His smile vanished. Moments later, voices rang through the trees. Drop your weapons. Sheriff Owen Carter and his deputies burst into the valley from the eastern trail. But they weren't alone. Several respected mountain guides rode beside them. Behind them came ranchers from neighboring valleys. Even a small hunting party that had traded with Silas for years joined the line. The outlaws suddenly found themselves surrounded. Wade looked in every direction. There was no escape. He urged his horse toward the northern pass anyway. Silas stepped into the open. You won't make it. Wade ignored him. His horse galloped toward the narrow canyon. Exactly where Silas expected. Only 50 yards ahead, the washed-out bridge ended in empty space. At the last moment, Wade pulled the reins. His horse stopped inches from the broken edge. Deputies surrounded him before he could turn around. One by one, the remaining outlaws laid down their rifles. The fight ended almost as quickly as it had begun. As dawn painted the mountains gold, Sheriff Carter removed Wade's weapons and shook Silas's hand firmly. "You were right again." Silas looked toward Abigail. "We all were." The sheriff smiled. "If you hadn't warned us about Iron Creek, we'd still be searching the wrong canyon." He turned toward his deputies. "I think it's time people heard the truth." Within days, the story spread across Montana territory. Not the old stories. The real ones. People learned that the quiet mountain man had guided lost travelers through blizzards. That he had warned lawmen about outlaw camps for years. That families caught in winter storms often found food and shelter at his cabin. The frightening rumors slowly disappeared. Respect replaced fear. Weeks later, wagons began stopping at the cabin for honest reasons. Travelers rested before crossing Eagle Ridge. Children laughed while chasing chickens through the yard. Neighbors shared meals beneath the apple trees. The lonely cabin no longer stood apart from the world. It had become part of it. One warm summer afternoon, Abigail asked Silas if he would ride with her to Red Hollow. He quietly agreed. The town looked smaller than Abigail remembered. Nothing had really changed. Except her. People who once ignored her now tipped their hats with quiet respect. She walked slowly down the familiar street until she reached the small house where her childhood had disappeared. Lenora opened the door. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Time had changed them both. Lenora's proud posture had faded. Her expensive dresses were gone. The porch sagged beneath years of neglect. "I heard about the mountains," Lenora finally said. Abigail simply nodded. "I also heard." She hesitated. "That he protected everyone." "Yes." Silence followed. Lenora lowered her eyes. "The money is gone." Abigail said nothing. "I lost the ranch." Still no answer. "I made terrible choices." For the first time in Abigail's life, her stepmother looked genuinely ashamed. "I don't expect forgiveness." Abigail studied the woman who had caused so much pain. Anger would have been easy. Hatred would have been understandable. But neither would change the past. She remembered something Silas once told her while repairing a broken fence. Some burdens become heavier the longer we carry them. Abigail finally spoke. "I hope someday you find peace." Lenora blinked. "That's all." There isn't anything else to say. She turned toward the waiting horse. She wasn't walking away from her stepmother. She was walking away from years of pain. As she climbed into the saddle, she felt lighter than she ever had before. Autumn arrived with brilliant colors across Eagle Ridge. Golden leaves drifted through the valley, while cool evenings invited everyone closer to the fireplace. One night Silas opened the old wooden box again. He removed the tiny boots and carefully placed them beside the fire. "I think it's time." Abigail looked at him. "For what?" He smiled sadly. "For them to be remembered with joy instead of only grief." He told her stories she had never heard. How his little daughter loved chasing butterflies. How his wife baked berry pies every Sunday. How laughter once filled every room in the cabin. Abigail laughed with him. She cried with him. And somehow those memories no longer felt like open wounds. They felt like treasured gifts. Winter passed. Then spring returned to the mountains. One bright morning neighbors gathered beneath blooming apple trees outside the cabin. Sheriff Carter stood beside ranchers, merchants, mountain guides, and families who had all been helped by Silas over the years. Mrs. Collins smiled proudly from the front row, her old brass compass tucked safely inside Abigail's pocket. Silas looked at Abigail. "I spent years believing I had lost my family forever. He gently took her hand. You reminded me that the heart can make room for hope again. Tears filled Abigail's eyes. I thought I had been abandoned. She smiled through them. But I was only being led home. The valley erupted in warm applause. Children laughed beside the stream. Horses grazed peacefully beneath the pines. The cabin that once inspired fear had become the safest place for miles. Years later, travelers crossing Eagle Ridge still stopped at the old homestead. Every stranger received a warm meal. Every weary rider found a safe bed. No one left hungry. No one left feeling unwanted. Whenever visitors asked how such a welcoming place came to exist, the older ranchers simply smiled. It started with a young woman who thought she had lost everything. They would glance toward the porch where Abigail and Silas welcomed another family arriving from the trail. And a mountain man who proved that the strongest hearts are often hidden behind the quietest faces. If this ending reminded you that kindness can change a life, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments what moment touched you the most, and subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories where hope always finds a way across the frontier.